welcome to the fourth session of Marine Biology Live. Delighted that Scott's joined us this morning, enthusiastic member of the MBA and is currently working with Thompson Environmental Consultants, and you're also the founder of Plover Rovers? Plover Rovers.
Plover Rovers. Plover Rovers. Plover Rovers.
Which I'm sure you'll come on to at the end of the talk.
Yes.
Scott's particularly interested in how we communicate marine biology to the wider community, so it's great that I think this platform will help with that and allow you to do some of that. So Scott's going to talk to us today about blue carbon, the role of coastal salt marshes in climate change mitigation, which I think you undertook some work during masters and other work, so
yes.
it's revisiting some stuff. But over to you, Scott, if you want to share your screen.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for having me this morning. And I'm just going to go ahead and share. So welcome everybody, and I'm really excited to be talking to you today about blue carbon and the role of coastal salt marshes in climate change mitigation. It's a topic that I'm very passionate about, and I really love the fact that I can revisit it now. As John said, it was the topic of my master thesis. Here we go. So first of all, to give you an idea of salt marshes in the UK, you can see we have about 820 square kilometers of coastal marshes in the UK. It's a very common habitat that we find almost everywhere around the UK coast. But just because it's common doesn't mean it's not under threat. Quite the opposite. Coastal marshes are receding at an alarming rate. And a lot has to be done in order to maintain them and make sure that they have a future in this country and worldwide, in fact. This is a typical marsh, one of the marshes I undertook my research on. Not what you initially associate with marine science, and a lot of people were surprised when I showed them the pictures, because they had imagined probably that I'd be diving with dolphins or something like that. But a very, very important part of the coastal ecosystem, and maybe sometimes a little bit overlooked. For those of you who are not completely familiar with coastal marshes, just a quick intro on the basic structure of the perfect idealized marsh. So we have the mudflat down here, which is not vegetated, just with some benthic diatoms, seagrasses and macroalgae. This is the mid-low water line, so anything that would be still below this line would be always underwater. Then this area between these two lines, this is the mid-high water at neap tide. So this is flooded for a lot of the time, which includes most of the pioneer zone, where we've got Spotina and Salicornia as the two dominant species most of the time. Then we have the mid-high water at spring tide. So this is still an area that's flooded quite often. This would be the lower marsh area with Puccinellia grasses dominating, and then we have the middle marsh, typically dominated by Festuca and Juncus communities, and most of the time over water, unless we have here the extreme high water line at spring tide plus storm kind of situations. And then we have the upper marsh here, which is shrubs, and basically where it goes into terrestrial vegetation. So that would be the ideal zonation of a coastal marsh. So why the interest in blue carbon? It's actually a relatively new topic. The first groundbreaking paper on it was in 2009, so it's only been about 10 years that there's really been a lot of interest in blue carbon. And it's because people realized that coastal ecosystems can play a very important role in mitigating climate change. We all know these graphs, but I had to put one in. That's the average carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. This graph, in this case, starts in 1980 and goes up to 2020, and we see that there's just a huge rise in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and obviously responsible for about 80% of the increase in heat trapping capacity of the atmosphere. So it's very important that we get this carbon out of the atmosphere. And coastal ecosystems can help do that. So if we're looking at coastal blue carbon, we've got quite amazing numbers. So, for example, every year, coastal wetlands sequester enough carbon dioxide to offset the burning of over 1 billion barrels of oil, or 726 tons of coal emissions are offset by just 1 hectare of mangrove. Coastal ecosystems are also the only habitat that can continually sequester and store carbon in the soil for millennia, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail later on. Seagrass is also very important. In some places can store twice as much carbon as captured by an average terrestrial forest just in 1 hectare of seagrass. So even though coastal wetlands are actually quite small in relation to the area of ocean, they store over 50% of the seabed's carbon reserves. So a very, very important habitat to look at when we're looking at carbon storage. And this is called here mapping ocean wealth. And we've had the word offset in there somewhere. So obviously there is a certain business aspect to this whole carbon storage. And that's what makes coastal ecosystems interesting all of a sudden also to people like this man here, who looks like he could also be working in the bank. And I always think when you have people like this all of a sudden interested in your ecosystem, there is definitely some business thought behind that. So there are major political and management drivers to protect natural systems and to use natural systems for carbon sequestration. I'm just going to see if this link works as well as it did when we tried it out. So this is a blue carbon counter by this oceanwealth.org. And it should be loading in a second. And this is actually counting the total amount of carbon dioxide that's sequestered by coastal blue carbon habitats since the start of COP21. So that's a very large number, as you can see. And these are the billions of tons of carbon sequestered since 1990 to the start of COP21. So again, billion tons. You see salt marshes were really sequestering a great number there. Of course, at the same time, once these habitats get degraded and destroyed, they also release a lot of carbon. So destroying these habitats has 2 negative effects. On the one hand, they don't sequester as much. On the other hand, they actually release carbon that they had previously stored. Get rid of this again. So yes, there's definitely a big case for protecting these wetlands, and I thought this slogan was quite interesting, bringing wetlands to market. So as I said, there is of course a market for carbon, and offsetting of carbon and coastal wetlands can play a part in that. There have been attempts to value blue carbon. Again, these are just very vague calculations, but just to give you an idea, a study in 2014 intended to put a value, monetary value onto it, and you see that already in the year 2010, salt marshes provided a value of over 10 million pounds a year in sequestration of carbon, and this is projected to increase tremendously in the next 50 years. This, of course, means that there is funding for science, and there are scientific working groups working on blue carbon. And one of these groups is the group that I was involved with when I was at Bangor doing my thesis, which is Seaside Carbon Storage in Intertidal Environments. And they're a project, interdisciplinary project, which aims to deliver discovery science to inform policy through an integrated study of blue carbon in the UK salt marsh habitats. So that's what my research was a part of. To just illustrate the importance of salt marshes once again, if we compare the carbon burial rate in grams per square meter per year of coastal ecosystems to terrestrial forests, which had been always the focus, of course, of carbon storage, we see that they are incredibly more efficient. And one reason for their efficiency is that a lot of the carbon stored in these ecosystems actually is stored in the soil. In forests, a lot of the carbon is stored in the living biomass of the trees, whereas especially with salt marshes and seagrass meadows, almost all the carbon they store is actually soil carbon. And that's also one of the reasons why this carbon is being stored there so long, for millennia, really, and without being released back into the atmosphere. So it's a very stable way of storing carbon. Once it's in the soil, it's just less likely to be released back out into the atmosphere, to put it very simple. So as I said, even though the salt marsh is a common habitat in the UK, it is a threatened habitat. And one of the main danger for salt marshes is drowning. As the sea levels rise, there is landward erosion of the seaward edge of the marsh. And if the marsh is able to just move and migrate inland, that's not a problem. It will just create new marsh. However, very often we have a situation where we have human-made structures like seawalls, which actually prevent this migration. We have a lot of reclaimed land on an area that could be marsh area, which is typically used for agriculture. And you can see here on the second picture, if there's a landward erosion of the seaward edge and the marsh can't migrate inland, the habitat gets squeezed and the marsh eventually will drown. Same thing if we have naturally rising lands, so marshes in areas where there is a cliff behind them are obviously very much at risk of drowning. So there's a lot of things that can be done in coastal management and flood defense management and things like that to actually preserve marshes and give them the possibility to migrate landwards to avoid drowning. Because if they drown and if we lose marshes, then obviously the salt marsh ecosystem services that we have are going to decline very severely. This is the tons of carbon sequestered per year. And this is the projection going to 2050 of how much less carbon will be sequestered by marshes due to changes in area if you apply a constant sequestration rate. So that's quite depressing. And something really has to be done to help the marshes keep providing this vital ecosystem service. Another graph like that, this is the percentage of marshes drowning under predicted rates of sea level rise, and we can see the different colors stand for different sea level rise scenarios, and even under the most optimistic scenario of 4.4 millimeters per year, you can see that worldwide about 60% of all marshes will drown, and in Europe it will be about 30% of all marshes if they don't have the possibility to migrate landwards. So obviously you might have seen the Wildlife Trust report Let Nature Help that just came out yesterday, which calls to let nature help us in our fight to mitigate climate change. And restoring marshes and giving marshes the possibility to survive in the face of sea level rise is one of the points they're making. The Wildlife Trust has a couple of managed realignment projects in Essex, for example, where they're doing that, where they're helping to create new marshes. So that's definitely a very important point. Also, we are in the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration. So again, there's a huge scope for restoration. We've lost since the early 20th century about 40% of salt marshes. But there is really a huge scope to halt this trend. At the moment, however, the UK really falls short of its targets, and we are currently losing around 100 hectares of salt marsh a year. So it would be really very, very important to get the policy on the way to halt that kind of negative trend. Now, to come to the actual research that we did on carbon storage. First of all, just a short note on the carbon that we find in salt marshes. We've got two types of carbon. We have autochthonous and allochthonous carbon. Autochthonous carbon is the carbon that the marsh basically produces autos, so itself, by the plants that are taking carbon from the atmosphere and transforming it via photosynthesis and putting it into their roots and then into the humic layer and in the end into the soil. And then there's allochthonous carbon that comes from the outside, which is actually little particulate matter that is in the water column that gets trapped in the marsh and then is deposited onto the marsh ground and eventually buried into the marsh soil as the sediments stabilize. So we've got these two sources of carbon coming into marshes. The major challenges for the research are to predict where exactly the carbon is stored in a marsh. So you've got the question, is there more carbon down in the mudflat and pioneer areas where you maybe have more of this allochthonous carbon being swept in from the sea? Is there more carbon in the mid-marsh or the high marsh areas? So where is it? Is there more carbon up top? How much carbon is up top on the marsh layers? How much carbon is down vertically, down below? So we just have to know where it is. Then we have to know what the drivers of the different levels of carbon storage are. So if we discover that there's a lot of carbon in the higher marsh, what's the driver? Is it the vegetation communities that we have there? Is it the soil properties that determine how much carbon a marsh can store? So that's kind of things that we looked at. And then, of course, in the end, to be able to predict blue carbon storage levels and design models to allow for also future like projections for policies and how that could affect carbon storage levels. These are the drivers that I looked at in my research. So we looked at elevation relative to tidal range. That will have an influence on how much of this allochthonous carbon is coming in. That is dissolved in the water column. It has an influence, of course, on the vegetation communities. So it has an influence on the autochthonous carbon that is produced by the plants, or not produced by the plants, but deposited into the earth by the plants. And it has an influence on chemical properties of the soil and on soil processes. We looked at the vegetation communities. Some species sequester more carbon than others. We looked at the chemical properties which affect the soil processes. We looked at grain size and porosity as sediment properties, and we looked at depth into the soil of the amount of carbon that's stored at every depth vertically into the soil. As far as the methods went, it's like I said, there's been about 10 years of very, very intense research on this. And the aim is, of course, to standardize data across studies so that we really increase the comparability. There's a guide that we followed to the methods for assessing carbon stocks. So that really is, of course, important to build up a database worldwide that we can use and compare data with. This is an example for one of our transects. So we would start down in the mudflat with our first plot outside of the vegetated zone, and we would go through the pioneer zone, the mid-marsh, the high marsh, and then up to the terrestrial fringe. We would take the elevation at each plot, because a marsh is, of course, not always a very nice slope. You'll have actually lower marsh areas somewhere further down, because they might just be might have a lower elevation and be subjected to more flooding than some spot in between. So that was all taken into account. Here you can see again that just from aerial imaging, you can really get quite a good idea of the zonation of a marsh, and you can make sure that your transect really covers all the different zones of a marsh. So when we then went out there, we set up our sampling quadrats. We did the vegetation sampling, so we get an idea of the vegetation community. And then we went and did the actual coring. Our study was special as far as that we cored very low down. So there's quite a lot of studies that only look at the first 30 centimeters of soil. We did core down to a meter wherever we could. Slightly over a meter, partly even. And it's really quite a simple way of taking samples. You can go out there with your sledgehammer and your plastic tube, basically, and have a lot of fun. And we had some very interested customers there looking at us and wanting to lick our equipment. So things you have to put up with, but we all got out of there in one bit, even though, of course, as you maybe know, more people die from cow attacks than from shark attacks every year. So it was high risk, but we came out fine. And then we made it to the lab. You cut open these cores, and then you get a very nice idea of the stratification, the vertical stratification of these cores, and then you basically go and bake mud cakes, because that's how you determine the percentage of carbon, by basically burning the organic components. So it's really, I'm not going to go into the details, but it's quite a simple process once you do it. And yeah, it's basically, I was always joking that it's professional mud cake, scientific mud cake baking that we're doing there. And once we had all our data, this is what we typically found. So this is pretty much what we expected. This would be a typical vertical soil carbon profile, where you have a lot of total organic carbon in the humic layer up here, which you would expect. This is where all the roots are, and where there's just a lot of carbon, but there's a pretty fast breakdown of this carbon by microbial processes and activities. So we have a pretty strong decrease in soil carbon density as we go downward. And then at a depth of, say, below 60 centimeters, this decrease slows quite a bit, and the levels of soil carbon are a lot more stable. And this deep carbon store is really quite interesting, because this is a large refractory fraction, which means that it has a high stability, slow breakdown, and this is really very, very long-term carbon storage, where this carbon store can just lock carbon in there for millennia, and doesn't really change much anymore. So this total organic carbon below about 50 centimeters is quite interesting when you're looking at low long-term carbon storage. And of course, such a curve could then be used to model the carbon storage capacity of a marsh. But one of the most exciting points of the research, I think, is that since marshes are such dynamic habitats, you have some marshes that have amazing stratification vertically going down core. So in this marsh, for example, what we had the humic layer up top, the current marsh layer, and then some more sandy, more marine sediment layers. And then we have probably a couple of hundred years ago, so it's important to think about when you look down such a core, you're literally looking at hundreds of years of history of this area. So maybe a couple of hundred years ago, there was a humic layer that got flooded maybe relatively rapidly, covered by marine sediments, and that actually now still houses a very high level of organic matter and of carbon. So obviously, if you have a marsh with a history like this one, it will store a lot more carbon than would be predicted from by assuming a normal curve, where you would expect this point to be around here at 0.01 maybe, but it's actually between 0.04 and 0.05 grams per cubic centimeter. Just one quick word about these numbers. It doesn't sound like a lot, 0.05 grams. But if you think about how many cubic centimeters there are in a marsh, it is a lot of carbon that's stored in there. So even if the numbers don't look impressive here, they are actually quite impressive. So obviously it's very good if you know the history of a marsh, because some marshes might have a much higher carbon storage than other marshes, depending on what we find as far as their stratification goes. This is just one of our findings that I wanted to present because I thought it was quite exciting, and that's that soil porosity seems to be very, very important for carbon storage capacity. We found extremely strong parallels between the patterns of soil carbon density and porosity. So by looking at the sediment properties of a given place, of a given marsh, you could already make some kind of predictions about its possible carbon storage capacity. As I said earlier, this whole research was kind of like the kicking off of the Seaside project, which was just starting at that time, which is producing the first large-scale empirical study of salt marsh carbon storage, accretion rates, drivers, long-term stability and resilience, and which then aims to provide practical guidance for coastal managers and inform shoreline policy, like I said earlier, to safeguard this carbon storage in the intertidal zone, which is something that is definitely a big priority, looking at the UK's ability to mitigate climate change and to achieve achieve this idea of becoming carbon neutral at some point. The outlook would be that blue carbon obviously should be included in the carbon budgeting, and this should provide enough enticement to protect and restore coastal marshes. There is still a lot of groundwork to be done until we will be able to predict the carbon storage capacity with any degree of certainty. We just need more data. As we saw, models should take marsh history into account where it is possible, because this might really have a big impact on how much carbon is stored in this particular marsh. And we saw also that surface carbon and deep carbon follow very different dynamics and should probably be modeled separately. So a lot of exciting work to be done and to look forward to in the coming years. That's all about the marshes, some of the inhabitants that we met while we were out there. Now I'm going to just say a quick word, like John already said, about the charity that I set up. That doesn't have anything to do initially with marshes, but it's sort of a part of it because it does have to do with the coast. And that's my charity, the Plover Rovers. It's basically a charity that aims to build bridges between science and society. We want to create knowledge, increase ocean literacy of coastal communities. We want to network for sustained engagement, empower coastal communities to face the sea, celebrate their local heritage, and highlight local issues, local coastal issues, and put them in a larger context. And overall, just raise the profile of the English coast. And how are we going to do that? We are going to do that by organizing a series of talks next year by members of the marine scientific community. So if you are one of them, listen up, because we would really like to hear from you and have you as one of our walker talkers. So the basic idea is there's so many people in marine science who love talking about their research and about marine topics, and there's also very many of us who love hiking the coast path. And this project, Talking the Coast, is basically combining these things and saying, well, let's walk the coast path, let's stop in the towns and villages along the way, and let's deliver exciting and engaging scientific talks there to the community to increase their ocean literacy and their knowledge about the area that surrounds them. Network together with local conservation groups to give people the ability to stay active locally afterwards, after listening to the talk and being enthused because of it, and then basically just empower these communities to face the sea and to deal with the issues that affect them in a more empowered way, because we give them a bit of a bigger horizon of where their local issues maybe fit in the big picture, and also to just get the science out there, get the science to the people, get the science into society by getting the scientists into society and combining it all. So yeah, we're working with a bunch of partners. I'm very grateful to the MBA to let me present this here at the end of my talk. We have already a group of wonderful volunteers signed up already. We're right now finalizing the task teams, and then we're going to be looking for a lot of walker talkers to inspire people in these communities, and then these communities will be able again to act and feed back into the conservation groups and everyone that we're partnering with. So if you're interested in knowing more about that, you can get in touch at plover.rovers@gmail.com, and also look at our website at plover-rovers.com. Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions, and thank you for your interest in this exciting topic.
Excellent. Thank you, Scott. Thanks for a great talk. Yeah, there's a few questions that have come in. So Nigel was saying tidal reed beds tend to be a bit of a vegetation monoculture. Are they as valuable carbon-wise?
Um, yeah, so reed beds do sequester quite a lot of carbon. I mean, if you have the typical Phragmites, I guess he's thinking about these big Phragmites beds. It is a species that does sequester quite a bit of carbon as far as the plant goes, but because it is it also breaks it down quite quickly. So I would say I don't know because actually the marshes that we looked at didn't have reed beds. I think
Right.
only one single one had reed beds. So I don't really have the data on that. I know that Juncus is very big on carbon sequestration that came out. So the Juncus things, but these are not the big reed beds. So
Yeah.
about the Phragmites beds, I wouldn't know the exact data on that.
Okay. Okay. Possibly into that, Ben has asked, how long do you think a managed realignment would take to store carbon at the rate of a natural marsh?
Probably a long time. There's some interesting research on those on the carbon storage capacity of these newly made marshes, man-made marshes, basically. And the first data does suggest that they differ quite a lot from the natural marshes. Also, I think if we think about these stratifications that I was talking about, obviously in a newly made marsh you wouldn't have that. So until it really builds up, and especially also the deep store carbon, which is then the carbon that really is going to be stored for a very, very long time, I imagine they're not going to be as valuable as existing marshes. So saving existing marshes should be definitely a priority. But then they are going to do a good job. So
Yeah, worth doing. Okay. I think this is a comment from Paul. Said tidal pumping will release carbon, CO2, carbon dioxide, and CH4 directly into the atmosphere and draw down O2 into the soil, increasing organic matter oxidation, creating a sea barrier with floodgates to allow flooding and drainage over periods longer than one tide should increase carbon storage. I guess you agree with that?
it sounds like I would agree with it, yeah, but
Yeah.
yeah, but I can't. That's about tidal barriers, is it? Or
Yeah,
tidal?
so creating a sea barrier with floodgates to allow flooding and drainage over periods longer than one tide. So with
Right.
that, so you're effectively flooding the land and keeping the water on the
Yeah.
land
Well,
longer.
it should definitely increase accretion rates of allochthonous carbon a lot,
Right.
like the carbon that's actually dissolved in the water column.
Yeah.
So the longer that's there, the more it can settle out. So that should definitely, yeah, that should increase.
Okay. Excellent. And uh, Alex has asked if you've got any recommendations you give to aspiring marine biologists and student members who might be interested in a career within this area of research.
Go for it. See if you can find any of the projects that are working on it right now, and try to connect to people working in these projects, and see if there's possibilities maybe for master or PhD students to do some research that could connect with it in some way. So yeah, but I definitely, like I said, salt marshes or generally these coastal habitats, I think, sometimes fall a bit by the wayside for marine biologists because it's not what you initially think about when you think
Yeah.
about marine habitats. But I think it's really great when marine biologists actually start being excited about things like salt marshes, even though you do not find dolphins there, but do find
Right.
a lot of other cool things.
There's a lot of cool things about salt marshes.
Definitely.
Um, and this the Seaside project, is that still active then? Is that
Yeah, they're still active, and they have on one of my slides. There was a link to their citizen science bit because what's quite exciting is that they developed an app, the Saltmarsh app, where people can actually go out and help collect data for this project. Because, like I said, it's huge. I mean, it's a huge idea that they really want to They want to create a massive data pool. So they're using citizen science as well for that. So it is still active and going.
I see Gerald's popped up actually. Oh no, he's gone again. So there is still stuff people can get involved in, because that's kind of key. You know what people can actually do. You talked about the massive decline in marsh. What would you suggest people do if they want to reverse that?
I would say, first of all, look at the citizen science side of it. Help to collect data, because it is going to be key to inform policymakers and to really provide, like I said, that enticement to keep protecting local marshes. If you do have local marshes, it's definitely worth looking at things like the local building plans and object to things that you think might, or there's probably local conservation groups that are aware of what's going on, and join these people in campaigning for especially this whole topic with managed realignment and with letting the marshes migrate inland. I think that's going to be a big topic for over the next couple of years, because that's being done already. There's been, of course, the affected communities aren't always happy if people say we're going to remove the sea defenses in order to let the marsh migrate, because if you bought a house there, you might not be very excited about that prospect. But that's definitely something to be aware of locally, and to just I think what will really help is to just be aware of your local surroundings and be aware of what's going on, and just try to be a part of the community that's trying to save the marsh, rather than just letting it kind of go on and disappear bit by bit.
Yeah. Okay. Two more questions, and then I think we'll have to leave it there. As a slight confession or advice, Nigel's requesting. He said he's possibly oversold the value of our local salt marshes to harbour authorities, and now have one that wants to use dredge spoil to build up the level of some mudflats to create salt marsh habitat. Have I overdone it?
I don't know. I don't.
Which is better, I guess.
Well, if you just look at levels, so what we find is that salt marshes do store a lot more carbon than mudflats. Mudflats do also store carbon, but salt marshes are more effective. So initially, I would think that it's not too bad to create. I mean, it depends a bit on the dredge spoil as well, doesn't it?
Yes. Okay.
But yeah, no. Generally, I don't think you have to feel too bad about it.
Okay. Good advice. And lastly, Coral said, great talk. Thanks, Scott. Have you or any colleagues shared your research with the Devon Climate Emergency Project?
Devon Climate Emergency
Project. And if not, I'm sure Coral can provide details about how to get in touch with them.
No, the whole thesis is available on ResearchGate as a complete text download. And I'm happy to get in contact with them, and also put them in contact with Seaside if they want that. Okay,
because Coral's provided a link as well.
Okay, great.
Okay, I see time is ticking on. We better leave it there. So thank you very, very much, Scott. That was an excellent talk. I'm just going to share my screen, and just to say the next Marine Biology Live session will actually be the Marine Biologist Magazine deep dive session. We've done one of these before where we go deeper into one of the subjects in the Marine Biologist Magazine, and that's scheduled for the 13th of August, Thursday again at 11 o'clock, and details on that will follow. Just to say and reiterate each time, the Marine Biological Association is of course a membership organisation. We'd be delighted if people took up membership. This is one of the things they can have access to, these Marine Biology Live sessions. We'll put them on YouTube, but we're going to put them on a week later, so it's better to attend the live session, and of course you can ask questions and get involved there. And we'd also be delighted to know if there are others out there who would like to do a talk through Marine Biology Live. If you want to get in touch with at events, at mba.ac.uk, then we'd be delighted to hear from you.